The concert hall was not like the ones he was used to. It was not grand. It was not filled with the rich and famous whispering in languages he recognized. This was a community hall in a town whose name he had already forgotten, tucked away in mountains that seemed to swallow the modern world whole. The air smelled of old wood and the faint, sweet scent of the pine trees outside, not of perfume and polish. He was Elias Thorne, and he was, by his own firm belief, the finest pianist of his generation. His fingers were insured for millions. Critics used words like dazzling and formidable to describe his technique. He agreed with them. This stop on his world tour was what his manager called a charity of image, a simple performance for simple people, a story for the press about bringing great music to forgotten places. Elias saw it for what it was, a tedious obligation. The people filed in, their faces wind-worn and kind. They dressed in their best, which was still far from the glittering gowns and tailored suits of his usual crowds. They nodded at him with a respectful shyness that he mistook for awe. He gave them his practiced, thin smile from the stage. He played for them. He played a complicated piece by a Russian composer, a storm of notes that required impossible speed and precision. His hands flew over the keys of the decent, but not exceptional, piano like striking hawks. He executed every difficult run perfectly, every dynamic shift exactly as written. It was a display of athleticism, a mountain climb of sound. When he finished, the room filled with warm, genuine applause. It was good applause, he thought. They knew they had witnessed something special from a man who was special. After the final bow, his manager had set up a small meet and greet in a corner of the hall. A line formed, mostly of older folks and a few wide-eyed children. Elias shook hands, signed programs with a flourish, and accepted compliments with a graceful nod. "Brilliant," one man said. "So fast," murmured a woman. Elias's smile remained fixed and polite. This was the dull part of the ritual. Then she approached. She was an older woman, standing a little apart from the line until it was her turn. She wore a plain, dark blue coat that had seen many winters. Her hair was a soft gray, pulled back simply. But it was her hands that Elias noticed as she took the program he had just signed for someone else. They were not the hands of a concert-goer. They were strong, capable hands with traces of old work in them, perhaps from gardening, or kneading bread, or chopping wood. They were respectful hands, but they held the program with a certain familiarity, as if it were a tool she understood. She looked up at him, and her eyes were a calm, clear blue. "Thank you for the music, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice soft but steady, carrying in the quieting hall. "You're very welcome," Elias replied, already starting to turn to the next person in line. "It was very impressive," she continued. "The Rachmaninoff. Your fingers, they are like lightning." He paused, turning back, the compliment fitting neatly into his expectation. "Thank you." She hesitated for just a moment, then spoke again, not to be rude, but as if she truly wanted him to understand something. "But I wondered. It was so fast, so powerful. Did you feel the longing in it?" The few people still nearby fell silent. Elias's polished smile froze, then twitched. He looked at her properly now. This woman, with her work-worn hands and her simple coat, was critiquing him. She was questioning his interpretation. "Beg your pardon?" he said, his voice cooling by several degrees. "The piece," she said gently, unfazed by his tone. "It's not just a storm. At its heart, it's a lament, a longing for a home left far behind. I just wondered if you felt that part while you were playing it so quickly." A hot spike of irritation shot through Elias. Who was she? A retired music teacher from some backwater school? Someone who had taken piano lessons as a child and thought she knew the soul of the great composers? This was the arrogance of the amateur, he decided. They heard the name, they heard the notes, and they presumed to understand the depths he had spent his life mastering. A low murmur went through the small crowd. They were watching, sensing a shift in the air. Elias's manager gave a small, nervous cough from the side. Elias let out a short, humorless laugh. It was a sound meant to put her in her place. "I see, and I suppose you have a deeper feel for the emotional landscape of Rachmaninoff?" He made the question sound ridiculous. The woman didn't blush or look away. She simply met his gaze. "I feel music, yes. It's not just notes on a page." "Clearly," Elias said, his voice dripping with condescension. He gestured broadly to the piano, still sitting on the stage under the lights. The idea came to him then, perfect and cruel. It would be a lesson for her, and a bit of drama for the bored locals. "Well then, why don't you show us? Since you understand the correct feeling so well." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not fear, but a kind of weary recognition, as if she had met men like him before. She shook her head slightly. "Oh, no, that's not necessary. This is your evening." But Elias was already riding the wave of his own arrogance. He raised his voice, playing to the growing audience. "No, please, I insist. A little duel. An educational moment for us all. You can demonstrate how it should be done." He smiled, a sharp, challenging smile. "Unless, of course, you'd rather not." It was a public dare, wrapped in fake courtesy. The people looked from Elias's triumphant face to the woman's calm one. There was a tension in the room now, a silent plea from the townsfolk for her to back down and avoid the humiliation they were sure was coming. The woman looked at the piano. She looked at her own hands, resting quietly at her sides. Then she looked back at Elias, and a small, almost imperceptible sigh escaped her. It wasn't a sigh of defeat, but of resignation. She had tried to offer a simple truth, and it had been met with a wall of pride. "All right," she said, so quietly that people leaned in to hear. "I could try." A ripple of surprise went through the hall. Elias's smile widened, genuine now with anticipated victory. He had called her bluff, and she was foolish enough to walk into the trap. He motioned for the crowd to part, leading the way back to the stage with the flourish of a ringmaster. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice echoing in the hall. "A rare treat. A masterclass from our very own local expert." The words were sweetly poisonous. He sat in a chair placed at the side of the stage, crossing his legs, the picture of relaxed expectation. The woman, Magga, though Elias hadn't bothered to learn her name, walked slowly up the 3 wooden steps. She didn't look at the audience. She simply stood before the piano for a moment, as if listening to a memory only she could hear. The grand instrument seemed to dwarf her. The lights from the ceiling made the polished wood gleam. Everyone waited. The only sound was the soft creak of the old floorboards as people shifted, waiting for the inevitable, awkward failure. Elias leaned back, ready to be entertained. This, he thought, would be the most memorable part of the entire forgettable evening. Elias sat in the chair beside the stage, the picture of smug expectation. He crossed one leg over the other, a faint, patronizing smile still fixed on his lips. The spotlight that had followed him all evening now felt hot and awkward on his face. But he wore it like a crown. He was the king here, and this was just a bit of court entertainment. He would be gracious in his victory, of course. Perhaps he would even offer a few words of encouragement to the old woman afterward. A pat on the head for a brave, if foolish, effort. The hall had settled into a strange, charged silence. The earlier murmur of conversation was gone, replaced by a dense quiet where you could hear the hum of the old stage lights and the rustle of fabric as people leaned forward. Some faces in the front rows showed concern, a soft worry for the woman who had stepped into the glare. Others held a flicker of hungry curiosity. A spectacle was a spectacle. After all, Elias decided to be the gentleman. He waved a hand toward the piano. "Ladies and gentlemen, our challenger," he announced, his voice too loud for the quiet room. "Shall I begin?" To set the standard, as it were. He didn't wait for an answer. He stood, gave a slight, theatrical bow to the audience, and reclaimed his seat at the piano bench. He adjusted it with a quick, practiced jerk, his back straight as a rod. He paused for a moment, fingertips hovering just above the keys, milking the tension. This wasn't just playing now. This was a demonstration, a lesson. He chose a piece he knew was technically brutal, a showy, modern arrangement of a famous classical theme, full of discordant chords, wild arpeggios that raced from the lowest bass to the highest treble, and rhythms that twisted and turned. It was music designed to impress, to stun with its complexity. It was a fortress built of notes, and he was its master builder. He took a sharp breath in and began. His hands were a blur. They slammed into clusters of keys with percussive force, then fluttered over runs so fast they sounded like a swarm of bees. He threw his body into it, shoulders dipping and rising with the force of his attack. He played with a cold, furious precision. Every note was a bullet hitting its target. The music was loud, complex, and utterly joyless. It was a display of pure, unadulterated skill, a mathematical proof performed in sound. He stole a glance at the audience. Their eyes were wide. Some had their mouths slightly open. Good, he thought. They are understanding the gap now. They are seeing what real mastery looks like. He saw his manager nodding slowly from the back, a professional appreciation for the flawless execution. He finished with a crashing, dissonant chord that reverberated in the wooden hall. followed by a flurry of ascending notes that ended with a sharp, final tap on the highest key. The sound hung in the air, harsh and brilliant, then faded into a ringing silence. For a second, nothing. Then the applause erupted. It was strong, appreciative, filled with the shock of what they had just witnessed. People clapped with real energy, some even whizzing. It was the applause for a high-wire act performed without a net. They were applauding the danger of it, the sheer nerve. Elias stood, soaking it in. He gave a deep, satisfied bow, his smile now genuine and warm. He had done exactly what he set out to do. He had raised the bar to an impossible height. He turned to where the woman still stood, a quiet, dark shape at the edge of the stage. He extended his hand toward the piano bench, a gesture of mock courtesy. "Top that, if you can," he said, not unkindly, but with the absolute confidence of a man who has already won. He returned to his chair, relaxed back into it, and prepared to watch the charming, inevitable stumble. The woman, Maggie, nodded slowly. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at the applauding audience. Her gaze was on the piano, as if seeing it for the first time, or perhaps the thousandth. She walked to the bench. She didn't adjust its height. Instead, she simply sat, her posture different from Elias's rigid perfection. She settled into herself, her shoulders soft. She placed her hands in her lap for a moment and closed her eyes. She took a slow, deep breath, letting the noise of the world, the residual energy of Elias's performance, the rustling of the crowd, the pounding of his own triumphant heart fade away. The hall grew quiet again. But this quiet was different. It wasn't the quiet of anticipation for a show. It was a waiting quiet, a respectful one. The last of the whispers died down. She opened her eyes and looked at the keyboard, not with the stare of a conqueror, but with the look of someone greeting a dear, old friend. Her hands, those rough, capable hands, came up. She didn't hover them dramatically. She simply laid her fingers on the keys, a gentle touch, as if feeling their temperature, their readiness. And then she began to play. It was not what anyone expected. There were no fireworks, no dizzying runs, no complex chords. It was a simple melody, an old, folk-like tune. It might have been something from these very mountains, passed down through generations. The notes were slow, spare, and clear. They fell into the silence like single drops of water into a deep, still pool. At first, a few people in the audience shifted. Was this it? After all that drama, this was her answer. A child's song. Elias felt a bubble of vindication rise in his chest. This was going to be a quieter humiliation than he'd imagined, but a humiliation all the same. But then, something happened. As the melody unfolded, note by deliberate note, it began to change. It wasn't the notes themselves, they remained simple. It was what she did with them. Her touch on the keys was not a strike, it was a caress. She used the pedal not as a blurring tool, but as a way to let each note breathe and blend into the next, creating a soft, resonant air around the tune. The dynamics were subtle, a slight softening here, a gentle swell there, like a storyteller lowering her voice for a secret, or raising it with a faint hope. She wasn't just playing the melody, she was speaking through it. The simple tune became a vessel. It carried the weight of years in its pauses. It held the quiet joy of a sunrise in its slight lifts. A profound, aching loneliness lived in the spaces between the notes. This wasn't music about impressing anyone. This was music about being about memory, about loss, about the quiet perseverance of a life lived in one place. Through all its seasons, Elias's smug expression began to dissolve. He stopped looking at her hands and started listening, really listening. The technical part of his brain, always analyzing, tried to dismiss it. Simple structure, basic harmony, child's play, but another part of him, a part he had buried under years of practice and performance and praise, was waking up. It was the part that had first fallen in love with the piano as a boy, not for the applause, but for the way it could make him feel. He heard something in her playing that his own had lacked entirely. Truth, a raw, unvarnished emotional truth that bypassed the brain and went straight to the heart. The hall was utterly, completely still. No one coughed, no one moved. People were not just hearing the music, they were seeing pictures in their minds. An old man by a fireside, a long, empty road, the first green shoot after a hard winter. Tears welled in the eyes of an older couple near the front, not from sadness, but from a recognition so deep it was painful. Elias felt a coldness seep into his stomach, a hollow feeling that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room, the fortress of his arrogance. built on a foundation of technical perfection, felt suddenly fragile. He had built a magnificent, complicated machine. She had planted a single, living tree, and in the shadow of that tree, his machine looked cold, empty, and useless. She played the final phrase, a series of notes that descended like a sigh of acceptance, and let the last note fade into nothingness, not with a bang, but with a whisper that seemed to linger in the wood of the floor, in the very air they breathed. There was no applause. Not immediately. For a long, breathless moment, there was only that lingering silence, thick and full. It was the deepest, most respectful silence Elias Thorne had ever heard. It was louder than any cheer, and in that silence, he realized his mistake. It was not a small one. It was the mistake of a lifetime. The silence after the final note was not empty. It was full. It was a living thing, thick in the air of the old community hall, pressing gently against everyone's skin. It was a silence of held breath, of hearts that had been touched and were afraid to break the spell with something as coarse as sound. For Elias, sitting in his chair by the stage, the world had narrowed to a single point, the echo of that last, fading whisper from the piano. Inside him, a storm was tearing down everything he thought he knew. The smugness that had propped him up just minutes before was gone, washed away, leaving a cold, hollow dread in its place. He stared at the woman Maggie as she lifted her hands slowly from the keys and let them rest back in her lap. She did not look triumphant. She didn't even look at the audience. She simply bowed her head for a moment, as if in private prayer or in silent conversation with the instrument. Then she stood up, her movement quiet and smooth. The motion broke the spell for the crowd. The silence shattered into a wave of sound so different from the applause that had followed his own performance. This was not polite or impressed. This was raw and emotional. It started with a deep, collective exhale, as if 100 people had remembered how to breathe at once. Then came the clapping. It wasn't the sharp, rapid applause for a great trick. It was slower, heavier, like a heartbeat. It built from the back of the room, gaining strength until it filled the space with a warm, roaring approval. People were on their feet. Some were wiping their eyes unashamedly. They weren't just clapping for a performance. They were thanking her for a gift, for a memory, for a truth. They had almost forgotten. Elias did not move. He did not clap. His hands were frozen in his lap. He felt like a man who had just seen a ghost. And the ghost was the soul of the music he had spent his whole life trying and failing to capture. He watched her walk away from the piano. She moved toward the steps at the side of the stage, her head still slightly bent. She wasn't leaving in a hurry, but she wasn't staying to take a bow either. She was simply done. She had said what she needed to say. As she passed his chair, something in Elias broke. His brain, trained for years to analyze and critique, was screaming at him. Asterisk simple structure, basic melody. Anyone could play those notes, asterisk, but his heart, a muscle he had neglected for decades, was pounding a different, terrifying message. It was telling him that she hadn't just played music, she had asterisk lived asterisk it. Every note was a story, every pause a lifetime. She had poured her history, the history of this quiet place, the joy and the sorrow of just being human, right into those simple, perfect phrases. His mouth was dried, his tongue felt too big. He had to say something. He had to know. As her foot touched the top step, he found his voice. It wasn't the clear, confident voice from before. It was a scratchy, broken thing, barely a whisper, but it cut through the noise of the applause. Wait, she paused, one hand on the railing. She turned her head slightly to look at him. Her face was calm, not angry, not gloating. There was a deep patience in her eyes, the patience of the mountains outside. Elias swallowed. The words felt like stones in his throat. Who are you? The people closest to the stage had stopped clapping to listen. A new quiet descended, just around them, a bubble in the middle of the still retreating applause. For a moment, she didn't answer. She looked at him, really looked at him, and he felt seen in a way he never had before. Seen past the expensive suit, past the famous name, past the technical skill, right down to the scared, proud boy hiding inside. Does it matter? She asked softly. To him, in that moment, it was the only thing in the world that mattered. He gave a small, desperate shake of his head. Unable to form more words, she sighed, a gentle sound that held no annoyance, only a quiet understanding. She looked down at her own hands, turning them over as if seeing the lines and calluses for the first time. A long time ago, she began, her voice clear and steady, meant just for him but carrying in the hushed space. I played the piano, not in halls like this, in the great ones, in cities so big and loud you could forget your own name. A jolt went through Elias, the great ones. He knew those halls. He lived for those halls. I played for thousands, she continued, her gaze drifting to a spot on the far wall, seeing a different time. I had the speed, I had the technique. The critics wrote words about me, too. A faint, distant smile touched her lips and was gone. I was going to conquer the world. Elias just stared, his mind reeling. Then life happened, she said, and the way she said it, those three simple words, held a universe of story of loss, of love, of duty, of choices made not for fame, but for heart. I came back here. This is my home. The piano. She looked back at the instrument on the stage. It became something different, not a weapon to conquer with, not a ladder to climb, just a friend, a way to speak when words aren't enough. I play for the love of it now, for the feeling, that's all. She gave him one last, long look in it. He saw no judgment for his earlier arrogance. If anything, he saw a flicker of pity, not for his humiliation, but for the long, lonely road he was on. She had been on it once, and she had chosen a different path. Then she nodded, a small, final gesture. She turned and walked down the 3 wooden steps. The crowd near the bottom parted for her respectfully, like a sea. People reached out to gently touch her arm, not to stop her, but to connect. She smiled at them, a real, warm smile that lit her face, and then she melted into the people, heading toward the back of the hall where the doors stood open to the cool night air. Elias was left alone in the spotlight. It didn't feel warm anymore. It felt like a prison cell. He was aware of every eye on him. He heard the whisper starting, rippling out from the epicenter of where he sat. He saw his manager pushing through the crowd, a look of frantic damage control on his face. But none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the echoing truth in the space she had left behind. I play for the love of it now. He thought of his own playing. The frantic, perfect, empty notes. He played for the reviews, for the size of the venues, for the next bigger contract, for the admiration in people's eyes. The love, the raw, simple, terrifying love of the sound, of the story had gotten lost somewhere. He had been polishing the empty box for so long. He'd forgotten there was ever supposed to be a treasure inside. The woman, Maggie, with her rough hands and her simple coat, had just shown him the treasure. And in doing so, she had shown him that his own magnificent box was hollow. The manager was at his side now, talking low and fast into his ear. Double quotes. Need to say something gracious, salvage the evening, compliment her folk style. It'll be a human interest story. We can spin this. Elias wasn't listening. He was watching the doorway she had disappeared through, into the dark. He had challenged a simple woman to a piano duel, and he had lost, not to her, but to himself. He had lost the moment he realized that the greatest musician in the room hadn't been him. The victory he had been so sure of had turned to ash in his mouth, leaving behind a taste more bitter than any failure, and a question he didn't know how to answer. If he wasn't playing for love, then what, in the end, was he playing for? The ride back to the small, quiet hotel in the valley was a journey through a silent, empty world. Elias sat in the back of the car, his face turned toward the window, but he saw nothing of the dark mountains or the pinprick stars above them. The only thing he could see was the memory of her face in the moment she'd spoken to him. The only thing he could hear was that simple, haunting melody, playing on a loop in his mind, clearer and more devastating than any complex symphony. His manager, who sat beside him, had talked for the first 10 minutes of the trip. He had spun plans like a spider weaving a web. It's a great story, really, he'd said, his voice too cheerful. The humble genius of the mountains. You were gracious to give her the stage. The press will eat it up. We can call it a collaborative moment, the meeting of two different musical worlds. The words sounded hollow and tinny, like coins dropped on a cheap floor. Elias had not answered. He'd just given a slow, stiff nod, a motion that had nothing to do with agreement and everything to do with wanting the noise to stop. Eventually, the manager had fallen silent, tapping on his phone, the blue glow lighting up his worried face. That night, in a room that smelled of pine disinfectant and old carpet, Elias did not sleep. He lay on the stiff bed, staring at the dark ceiling. The silence of the place was absolute, a deep well of quiet that his own buzzing thoughts could not fill. He kept replaying the evening. His own performance felt like a distant, embarrassing dream, all flash and no substance, like a firework that leaves only smoke and a ringing in the ears. Then her music would return. It didn't just play in his head. It settled there, It felt like a quiet truth he had been running from his whole life. He thought about her words. I played in the great halls. It explained everything and nothing. It explained the profound, effortless command she had over the instrument. A command that went far beyond notes. But it made her choice to be here, in this forgotten place, playing for the love of it even more mysterious and powerful to him. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt ashamed, not of losing a silly challenge, but of the person he had become. The arrogant, polished shell of Elias Thorne felt like a cheap costume. Underneath, he was just a man who had forgotten why he'd ever sat down at a piano in the first place. The next day, they drove to the nearest city, where the next concert on his tour was scheduled. It was a proper venue, a modern concert hall with perfect acoustics and 2,000 seats already sold out. The usual rituals took over. The sound check, the meetings with the local promoters, the choosing of his suit. He moved through it all like a ghost, performing the motions of being Elias Thorne. He smiled when he was supposed to smile. He gave short, practiced answers in interviews, but his eyes were distant. The manager watched him nervously as the hour of the performance approached. Sitting alone in his stark dressing room, Elias felt a cold panic begin to rise. He looked at his hands. They were the tools of his trade, insured, celebrated. Tonight, he was supposed to play a program he had performed 100 times, a demanding, impressive selection designed to showcase his legendary technique. The thought of playing those pieces now made him feel sick. They felt like lies, empty demonstrations. After what he had heard, how could he go back to just making impressive noise? A knock came at the door. His manager peeked in. 5 minutes, Elias, they're ready for you. He looked at Elias's pale face. You okay? Just play like you always do. They love you out there. Elias nodded, but said nothing. He walked down the long, hushed corridor toward the stage entrance. He could hear the murmur of the large crowd, a familiar sound that had always been the fuel for his engine. Tonight, it sounded like static. The stage manager gave him a thumbs up. The announcer's voice boomed through the hall, full of excitement, listing his awards, his genius. The curtain went up. The spotlight hit him as he walked to the center of the vast stage. The applause was thunderous, a wave of adoration. He bowed automatically. He sat at the magnificent, gleaming concert grand piano. He placed his fingers on the cool, perfect keys. 2,000 people held their breath, waiting for the storm of his skill. He looked out at the sea of expectant, shadowy faces. He thought of the small community hall. He thought of the rough hands on the simpler keys. He thought of the silence that had been louder than any applause. He leaned toward the microphone. His voice, when it came, was quiet, and the perfect acoustics carried it to the very back row. Last night, he began, and the crowd instantly hushed, surprised by the speech. Last night, in a small town in the mountains, I was given a lesson in what music can be. He paused, his throat tight. I was reminded that before music is about skill, it is about feeling. It is about truth. He saw his manager standing in the wings, his face frozen in confusion and horror. This was not in the script. Elias looked down at the keys. I had planned to play something very different for you tonight, but I find I cannot, not yet. Instead, I'd like to play something I heard. It's a simple tune. It was played for me by someone who understands the heart of it. He took a deep breath, shut his eyes, and tried to push the world away. He wasn't trying to copy her. He knew he couldn't. He didn't have her life, her story, her soul. But he could try, for the first time in his professional life, to be honest. To play not as Elias Thorne, the virtuoso, but as a man who was listening, truly listening. For the first time, he began the melody, the same simple, folk-like tune. At first, his fingers, trained for complexity, felt clumsy and heavy on the simple notes. The sound was too perfect, too clean. He faltered, missing the deep, resonant simplicity she had found. A ripple of uncertainty went through the audience. He heard a cough. Then, he stopped trying to perform it. He thought instead of the feeling it had given him, the hollow ache of realization, the longing for something lost, the beauty in simple, honest things. He let his guard down. He let the technique serve the feeling, not the other way around. And slowly, something shifted. The notes began to breathe. He softened his touch, letting the spaces between the notes speak as loudly as the sounds. He added a gentle harmony, not something showy from a textbook, but a chord that felt like a shadow, or a memory. He wasn't playing her story anymore. He was playing his own, his confusion, his shame, his dawning, fragile hope. The audience was so quiet it was as if they had disappeared. The great hall, built for roaring crescendos, was holding a whisper, and in that whisper, Elias found something he had never found in all the roaring applause: a connection. He wasn't playing asterisk at asterisk them. He was sharing something asterisk with asterisk them. When the last note faded, the silence returned, but it was a different silence than the night before. It was a city silence, fast and uncertain. Then, the applause began. It started slowly, thoughtfully, then swelled. It wasn't the wild cheering for a triumph. It was deeper, more respectful. It was the sound of people who had been moved, not just impressed. Elias stood up. He felt drained, but clean. For the first time in years, he felt real. He bowed, not with a flourish, but with a simple, genuine gratitude. He left the stage, the applause still washing over him. Back in the wings, his manager was there, his expression a mix of shock and calculation. "That was a risk," he said finally. "But the mood in there, it's different. They're talking. It's all they'll talk about." Elias just nodded. He didn't care about the talk. He walked past him, back to the dressing room. He sat alone in the quiet, the ghost of the simple melody still in the air. He hadn't won anything back. He hadn't erased his mistake from the night before. But for the first time, he felt like he might be on the right path. The duel was over. The real work, he understood now, was just beginning. He had to learn, all over again, how to play. Not for the world, but for the music itself. And somewhere, in a quiet house in the mountains, a woman who had once played in great halls might have understood that better than anyone. The morning after the city concert was a whirlwind of a different kind. Elias's manager was a busy man, his phone buzzing like an angry hornet. The reviews were not the usual praise of technical mastery. They were something else. Words like raw, transformative, and profoundly human were used. Critics wrote about his courageous departure and the haunting folk melody that had become the talk of the classical music world. They called it a renaissance, a shedding of skin. Elias read them in his hotel room, feeling a strange detachment. The praise felt like it was for someone else, a man who was just beginning to exist. The old hunger for such accolades was gone, replaced by a quiet need that was harder to satisfy. He didn't want headlines. He wanted truth. He wanted to feel that connection again, not with an audience of thousands, but with the music itself. He canceled the next 3 stops on his tour. His manager nearly had a fit, but Elias was firm for the first time in their relationship. "I need to be quiet," was all he said. He didn't go back to his luxurious apartment in the city. Instead, he instructed his driver to take him back to the mountains. Not to the town, exactly, but to a small, secluded cabin he rented nearby. A place he had once used for photo shoots about his rustic inspirations. Now, he went there to be alone. For weeks, he lived simply. He brought only a few things: clothes, some books, and a small, portable electric keyboard. It was a far cry from a concert grand. The sound was thin and artificial, but it didn't matter. He wasn't practicing for a performance. He was learning to listen. He would sit for hours, not playing, just thinking. He thought about the woman, Maggie. He never went to look for her. He felt that would be an intrusion, another act of taking. She had given him his lesson. The rest was his to figure out. Instead, he tried to remember the feeling her music had created in the hall, the sense of shared memory, of unspoken stories. He tried to strip away everything he knew about impressing a crowd. He began to play, but differently. He played scales not as a warm-up exercise, but listening to the resonance of each note, how one flowed into the next. He messed up simple children's songs, fumbling for the emotion within their basic structures. He spent an entire day on 4 bars of a Chopin nocturne, not to perfect the fingering, but to try and find the sorrowful longing that was supposed to be there. It was frustrating, humbling work. He felt like a child again, but a child without the natural joy. He was an adult, painfully dismantling a fortress he had spent a lifetime building. One afternoon, he put his head in his hands after a particularly failed attempt. The silence of the cabin pressed in on him. He was a world-famous pianist, and he felt he couldn't play a single honest note. The arrogance was gone, burned away, but what was left felt fragile and small. Months drifted by. The story of the piano duel in the mountains had become a minor legend, a piece of musical folklore. Elias gave a few interviews, but he deflected the myth-making. He spoke only of the importance of feeling in music. He started to include simpler, more lyrical pieces in his performances. The flashy, impossible showpieces began to disappear from his programs. His playing changed. It was still technically brilliant, that could not be unlearned, but now it had a warmth, a vulnerability that audiences found captivating in a new way. He was no longer a distant god of the keyboard. He was a man speaking a beautiful, complex language. One day, a small package arrived at his manager's office, forwarded to the cabin. It was a plain cardboard box. Inside, nestled in crumpled brown paper, was a vinyl record. There was no note. The sleeve was blank, homemade. Curious, Elias put it on the old turntable he kept for nostalgia. The first crackles of silence gave way to piano music. His breath caught. It was her. It was Maggie. But she wasn't playing the folk tune. She was playing Bach, the complex, interweaving lines of a fugue, a piece built like a magnificent, intricate mathematical puzzle. Yet, in her hands, it was not a puzzle. It was a conversation. Each voice in the fugue was clear, distinct, singing to the others. It was joyful, intelligent, and deeply peaceful. It had the same quality as her folk melody: absolute honesty, a profound sense of rightness. She wasn't battling the complexity. She was dancing with it, with a mastery so complete it looked like simplicity. Elias listened to the whole record. Side A and then side B. There were other pieces: a tender Brahms intermezzo, a fiery scrap of Scarlatti, and finally, a version of that same mountain folk tune, this time with slight, beautiful variations, as if the story had grown a little in the telling. He sat in the cabin's dim light as the needle hit the run-out groove and lifted with a soft thump. He felt no jealousy, no defeated shock. He felt a profound gratitude. This was the final piece of the lesson. She wasn't just a vessel for simple feeling. She was a complete musician. She had chosen her world, and in that world, her art had grown deep, quiet roots. She had sent him this not to show off, but to say, without words, this is what it can be. When it is for love, it can be anything. He took the record off carefully. He didn't need to hear it again right away. The message was inside him now. Years later, Elias Thorne was still a famous pianist, but the man was different. He started a foundation that brought music teachers, not just performers, to small towns. He often spoke of the debt he owed to a place he would not name, and a person he would not identify. One bright autumn day, he found himself driving through the mountain region again. On an impulse, he turned off the main road and wound his way to the small community hall. It looked the same, a little more weathered. There was no concert that day. The door was unlocked. He stepped inside. The air still smelled of old wood and dust. The stage was empty. The piano was there, the same one. He walked up the 3 steps and sat on the bench. He didn't play. He just sat there in the quiet, sun streaming through the high windows, motes of dust dancing in the beams. He thought of the arrogance that had filled this space. He thought of the silence that had followed it. He thought of the long, quiet path that had led him back here, to a place of peace. Finally, he stood up. He reached into his pocket and took out a single, smooth stone he'd picked up from a riverbed on his walk that morning. He placed it gently on the corner of the piano, a small, silent thank you to an instrument and to a teacher. He walked out, got in his car, and drove away. He was playing a concert that night in the city. The program included a piece he had written himself, a lyrical, gentle composition that echoed, just a little, the melody of a mountain folk song. It was not a copy. It was his own story now. And in a small house on the edge of the same town, an older woman was working in her garden. The soil was dark and rich in her hands. Later, she would go inside. She might sit at her own piano, an old upright that was slightly out of tune, and play for a little while. Not for anyone, just for the joy of the sound, for the feeling of the cool keys under her fingers, for the way the afternoon light fell across the floor. The duel was long over. There had never really been a winner or a loser. There had only been 2 musicians, and the music that had finally, quietly, brought them to where they were always supposed to be.